I'm very, very happy to introduce one of our aspiring historians in Canada, a wonderful brother who has done a lot of research about Islam in Canada. Islam in Canada. We have Hassam Munir, and he is the professor of Islamic history. He was born in Pakistan. He arrived in Canada in the year 2000 and has lived in Toronto ever since. He completed a Bachelor of Arts in History and Communications from York University in 2017 and is pursuing a Master's of Arts degree in Mediterranean and Middle Eastern History at the University of Toronto, which he is scheduled to complete next year, 2020. Since early 2018, Hassam has also been a research fellow at the Yaqeen Institute of Islamic Research. In October 2017, he was recognized by Heritage Toronto as an emerging historian in the city. In the field of history, he formerly worked with the Ontario Historical Society as an archival researcher. Hassam also has a background in journalism, having served as a sports and health editor between 2015 and 2016, and executive editor of Excalibur. During the day, he works in the Public Relations Department at Islamic Relief Canada. We're very, very proud and honored to welcome our dear brother from Canada, Hassam Munir.
Assalamu alaikum. Is this clear? Can everybody hear me? It's a small gathering anyways, alhamdulillah. First of all, I'd like to thank you, Brother Yasin, for the incredible introduction. As you can all tell, I wrote it myself.
Yeah.
Which is why I'm so great. So it's a pleasure to be here with you all, and I'm going to be discussing the history of Muslims in Canada and sort of focusing on a broad overview because we have specialists who will be discussing particular communities that have thrived, particular Muslim communities in Canada that have thrived for a very long time. And inshallah, if there's time at some point later on, if anything really sparks your interest, we can definitely come back to it and discuss it further. Now, I like to go as far back as I possibly can because as a historian, that gives me something to do. The further back you go, the more questions open up, the more things you can explore, and the more there is to learn, even in situations when there's not really a concrete story to be told, when there's not really extremely firm evidence to base some kind of conclusion on. That being said, I'd like to go back about 1,000 years to this particular person. So, can I just get a show of hands? Who has heard of Al-Biruni in this audience? So a few people, alhamdulillah. This is an incredible Muslim thinker, anthropologist. He's considered a sort of a father figure in many different modern fields of the social sciences, and scientist as well. And he lived in Washington D.C. No, I'm kidding. He lived in about 1,000 years ago in what we would now call Iran and Pakistan, Afghanistan. In that region, he was sort of moving around a lot. And he had this incredible, vision. Like his intelligence, mashallah, just reading about some of his achievements at the time, just using some of the technology that was available at the time and observing the landscape around him. One of his greatest achievements was that he was able to figure out the circumference of the earth. So not only did he know that the earth is round, but he was able to figure out the circumference of the earth 1,000 years ago and come within 10% of the modern figure that we have today, which is an incredible achievement in the time when there were no satellites, no world maps, nothing like that. And the common belief at the time was that this landmass that connected Africa, Asia, and the European continents, and obviously people by then had become somewhat familiar with Australia, very few people, but there was some awareness. But among the people living in that part of the world, that was it. Like, two-thirds of the world is just this enormous ocean, and then we have these continents on one side of the world. But from a scientific basis, Al-Biruni came to the conclusion that there had to be a landmass within that 2/3 of the ocean that was assumed is just all ocean, right? Because there were indigenous people, native people living here, but on the other side of the world, in those 3 connected continents, anyone who was living there was sort of disconnected and unaware that there was this other continent, much less that there were also people living there. But Al-Biruni went a step further, and he also surmised that not only was this continent there, but that there was no reason to believe that there was nobody living there. And he actually wrote about this 1,000 years ago, that there may be people living. Not only must there be, from a scientific basis, this enormous landmass, but there must be people living there as well. And as you can see, this is a modern historian of astronomy at a European university, and he says that I see no reason to exclude Al-Biruni from the list of early discoverers, quote unquote, of America, because from a scientific basis, he was able to predict this. So that shows some level of Muslim awareness, even though they weren't exactly, very knowledgeable about what they were discussing, but they were discussing this different part of the world, what much later became known as the New World. So that's something interesting that I always like to start off with. Now here's another sort of mythological history almost, right? And one of the first things we learn in the historical discipline is that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because there is no firm, concrete, conclusive evidence for a particular narrative or a particular event does not mean that the event did not happen, that situation did not develop, that there's nothing to explore there, right? And many times you will see that many historians will come across a theory or come across something interesting, and because the evidence that they require based on their academic sensitivity isn't immediately available to them, they'll just toss it out the window, which I think is a disservice to history, right? Even if something is just a theory, even if it's just a sort of cultural memory, things we remember, well, why do we remember? Why do we wish certain things would have been a certain way? Even there's a lot for us to learn. So I don't know how familiar you guys are in the US with this narrative here, but the first Europeans to actually reach the Americas, the New World, were actually the Scandinavians, or what we call the Vikings, right? They came about 1,000 years ago, so actually around the same time that Al-Biruni was writing. And they sailed from, they lived in Northern Europe to begin with, in Norway, in Sweden, as we know today. They sailed to Iceland and built settlements there, and because of some infighting among them in Iceland, many of them actually came to what we call Newfoundland, which is I think the furthest east point in all of the Americas, this island far in the east of Canada. And I'm going to try to describe geographic locations within Canada, and hopefully it would have been nice to have a big map somewhere, but hopefully we can get a general sense of where things are as I'm describing them. Now the interesting thing is, so in Newfoundland, this is their settlement. I'm hoping you all can see it, which is still preserved. It's called Lonceau Meadows in French. And it's still preserved as a heritage site. But you can see the typical Viking longhouse, right? And just the way their villages were structured. And this settlement, there's some debate about did it last a few years or did it last a few decades? It did not last very long, and they left. But why would I mention this in connection to the history of Muslims in Canada? There is a growing body of research that suggests that there were strong connections between the Vikings and the Muslims, especially the Muslims in Al-Andalus. And if you think about it, these two places are not that far apart. Vikings are obviously they're plunderers for the most part. And when you're a plunderer, the only way you really make money is not from what you plunder itself, but what you can sell it for. And the biggest market in Europe at the time is actually Al-Andalus, it's Spain. So there's a lot of interesting, some that we do have firm evidence of in Viking sources, in Muslim sources, these interactions, right? And we have these very old texts that discuss sort of this relationship between the Vikings and Muslims. Sometimes, every once in a while, some new evidence will pop up, and then it'll be discussed and it'll be debated, etc. But also modern research as well. So this is a very interesting research topic in Islamic history at the moment. As you can see, there's a new book that came out, and I just put the titles of some of the chapters of that book. And evidence for Islamic scientific works in medieval Iceland, the life of Prophet Muhammad in East Norse, which is the language that they spoke. So there's a lot of interesting things to explore here. Could some of those Viking settlers that first came to what is now Canada, could some of them have been Muslim? It's not something that can be rejected out of hand. It's not something that's impossible. There's no concrete evidence for it either, but I think it's a theory that's worth exploring. Excuse me. And obviously the other extremely important theory is Islam among the indigenous or native people themselves. I'm not going to go too far into that because Sheikh Quick, I believe, does start off with that discussion. Okay, now I said it, so now you have to. Because he does do an excellent job in explaining the dynamics of that discussion, but obviously there is a strong possibility, and as we know from our Islamic sources, that a prophet prior to Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was sent to each nation, and certainly there's no reason to assume that does not include the indigenous nations here who have been here for a very long time. So the core concepts of Islam, such as Tawheed, etc., you can also find some traces of them in modern indigenous religion and culture. So there's a lot to explore there as well. And it's a very interesting discussion about just how long could Islam have been present in the land that we now call Canada. And the third sort of, this is where we start to get into actual history, so to speak. Right? This is a picture of a place called Africville in Nova Scotia. It's a sort of, Nova Scotia is again far in the east of Canada, close to Maine. And this was a community of Black settlers who had moved up mostly from the Caribbean in the 1700s, in the mid 1700s, from the Caribbean, and also some of them from the United States. They had moved up and sort of been moved by the British from their colonies in the Caribbean up to British North America, or what later became Canada, and they established their own community there. Once again, like as we know, so many of the Black peoples, the peoples of African descent who were brought from Africa through the transatlantic slave trade, they were Muslim, right? There's a large population, large percentage of them were Muslim. We don't know, again, if there's any concrete evidence that any of those or their descendants who ended up moving to this particular settlement in Canada in the 1700s had been Muslim. But again, it's a very interesting theory to explore. And we have a professor out in Nova Scotia. Her name is Dr. Afua Cooper, and she has this line that always resonates with me. She says, slavery is Canada's best kept secret, right? There was slavery in Canada, just like there was slavery in the United States, not as widespread, not as intensive perhaps, but it certainly did occur. And but we have a habit of completely brushing it under the carpet, even though we have huge archives full of documents related to slavery, and our professors and historians always encourage us, if you really want to make a contribution to social justice in Canada as a historian, that is the topic you should be focusing on. Those are the archives that need to be opened up, and I'm sure there are a lot of Muslim stories within those archives to be explored. But the first Muslims in Canada, so who were the first Muslims in Canada that we actually know of? I'm sorry to disappoint, but it's none of the people in this picture. The only reason I put this picture up is because this represents a typical Scottish family, a family of Scottish immigrants in the mid 19th century, so the mid 1800s. And that's because the first Muslims that we know of from the census records were a young couple, James and Ains Love, that was their name, and apparently they had embraced Islam in Scotland before they moved over to Canada and came here. And when the census records came around and they had to fill out what religious affiliation they had, they put themselves down or had somebody else put them down as Mohammedans, right? Which is what in the British world, especially, Muslims used to be called back in the day. So that is the first record we have. When did they come? They came in 1851. So we can go as far back in Canada to have a firm evidence of a Muslim presence in Canada back to 1851. And they had a large family and they lived somewhere in southern Ontario, and all of this information is just based on census records. We have no information beyond that, and unfortunately, we haven't been able to trace their family, to the present day or what their situation is, what happened. It would be an amazing story to tell, and we're still working on that. But that was the first record. So 1851, we have these first sort of inklings of a Muslim presence in Canada, and in the decades that followed, this number would slowly grow, very, very slowly. And I think some of the numbers might be a little baffling for you guys here in the States, just because of how large of a community you've had for so long, right? But it just goes to show how many stories we may not be telling, right? So why are the numbers so small? Were there actually no Muslims, or is it just that we don't know the information? We don't have the information to discuss. So this is a picture of a person named Muhammad Bakwakwa, right? And he was from what is now Nigeria. He was brought to Brazil in the early 1800s as a slave, as a young man. He was captured in Africa at the age of 17, brought to Brazil, and he has this incredible story. And one of the points I hope to get across in my talk, and I think the others will touch on it as well, is that for Muslims in the Americas, I think it's extremely important for us to share each other's histories and stories like this and start to develop more of a regional focus rather than a nationalistic focus, because there's so much we have to learn from each other and to share and inspire each other as well. So Muhammad Bakwakwa, he comes as a young man to Brazil as a slave, and he is not in a plantation style system, but he is more of a domestic slave and helping his owner with his work. He was some kind of tradesperson, and but eventually the trades, while helping his owner, it brings him on a ship to New York. So Brazil was obviously the very last place that they outlawed slavery. In New York at the time, it was already outlawed. So Bakwakwa was somehow aware of this, and as soon as he got to New York, he just jumped off the ship and swam to the shore, and technically he was free, right? But there were obviously, the racism was still there, and he faced all of these challenges in trying to have his freedom recognized, so he escaped to Haiti, and the situation in Haiti got a bit tight for him as well, so eventually making his way back up to through the United States, he made it to Canada, and he came to a place called Chatham, Ontario, which is not too far from Windsor. So he came in Chatham in 1854. So in 1854, you'll see in a second, I'll have the numbers, you have a total of 4 known Muslims in Canada. So you have the 2 who came in 1851, the Scottish couple. They had a child the following year, so their child, and then Muhammad Bakwakwa, these 4 in 1854. In 1854, he was here in Chatham, and he dictated his story, the story of his life, to the person sitting beside him here, who was an abolitionist activist, and his story was written down, and it actually helped many other slaves near the end days of slavery in the United States. His narrative, what they call the slave narratives, actually helped a lot of them escape their situations as well. But obviously, one of the reasons it's so hard to trace this history is because many of these peoples of African descent who were brought to the New World were just trying to go back home, right? They weren't interested, even after many years of staying in the United States or Brazil or Canada or whatever it was. So Bakwakwa as well was trying to go back home, and he eventually did leave Canada, but we're not sure exactly what happened to his story afterwards. Excuse me. So you see there, the numbers grow extremely slowly, but again, it's the numbers that we know of, and does not necessarily include numbers we may not know about, right? But what begins to happen around the turn of the century and around 1900, from the Middle East is one, the situation in the Middle East at the time with the Ottoman Empire really on its last legs, and many of the Ottoman, the Ottoman territory in what we call now Syria or Lebanon or Palestine, etc. The situation was extremely difficult. There was a lot of mismanagement, and a lot of young people especially were forced to join the Ottoman army. And that became sort of a reason for them to try to escape that situation, because it was being forced to join an army that was constantly losing wars, right? And you could tell that this whole empire, this entire system, which had lasted for like 600 years, was really on its way out within a few years. So a lot of young men start to sort of find ways out. Many of them come to the United States, right? And many of them actually go from the United States into Canada. Some of them go directly to Canada. And this is just a typical example, right? Many of them would come to the eastern ports in Canada, so Halifax, Montreal, some of these cities that you may have heard of. But the message they would get as soon as they arrived is continue going west, because all of the opportunities were west, right? And you guys, I think, have somewhat of a similar history here in the United States, where it's extremely difficult to tie these very wide countries together, bring it all together, because most of the action is always on the East Coast. That's where Europeans first arrived. Canada was facing the same problem, where there was this large, not empty land, there were indigenous people there, but that's like another story, because the government was also trying to put down any sort of indigenous self-determination at the time, any sort of indigenous freedoms, and they wanted settlers to settle this land in the prairie provinces. So just north of like North Dakota, I guess what we call Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba, our prairie provinces in the center, that's where all of these people were told to go. Many of them would stop in London, Ontario. Some of them would continue on from London, Ontario, but many of them would stay there, and Imam Tawakkul will, in a later presentation, discuss the community in London, Ontario. And what's interesting is that this is chain migration, so this is how this works, and I guess this is how some of us, like myself for example, this is how we end up in Canada or the US, which is one person comes, and after a few years they find some success, and they write a letter back to their village, and like 10 other guys get up and they're like, what am I doing here? I'm gonna go where that guy is apparently having a great life, right? So they all sort of would migrate to the same place, and this is how the first communities start to be formed, because as soon as you get here, you're looking for someone who looks like you, who speaks your language, who can sort of ease you into the system here, and it's not very easy. It's actually pretty difficult to adjust now, so imagine even more so back then. So this is why these communities start to develop, and the first communities were in Alberta, so that's out west, again, because everyone kept being told to go west. That's where all the opportunities are. Small pockets in Montreal, small pockets on the East Coast, as well as in London, Ontario, like I mentioned, this very strong Arab community from the beginning, and almost all of them coming initially, at least, from what we now call Lebanon. So I want you to, like, as we go through some of these numbers, I want you to keep in mind when I mention a particular number, just compare it to like the total number of Muslims in Canada, like 1921. As far as we know, there's only like less than 500 Muslims. So keep that in mind. I think it puts a lot of things into perspective as well. Now they started coming here in 1900. The 1910s decade is considered the worst sort of decade for Muslims in Canada for as long as they've been here out of all those years. It's the only decade in which the population, the overall population of Muslims in Canada, rather than having a net growth, it actually had a net decline, right? So we have all these people constantly coming in, but in the 1910s, the population declines. One reason for that is obviously the First World War, right? Because the war interrupted immigration. It was just so difficult to get around. And even the people who are coming from anywhere knew that you're gonna come here, and one of the first things that's gonna happen is you get shipped over to Europe, right, to fight over there. So it wasn't really a great opportunity. And the other thing that happened was a lot of discrimination, right? And this is a narrative that, again, Canada likes to conveniently brush under the carpet, especially because in all things we compare ourselves to the United States. It's like, oh, like look at Donald Trump, and I don't know, look at like all the horrible things happening in the US, right? I haven't seen anything so far, alhamdulillah, you guys are doing pretty good. But in Canada, we do have this history, and even nowadays, there are things that are, if you actually live there, you're obviously very aware of, that are extremely problematic. But let me go into the history for a second, and particularly how it affected the Muslims. So this is a photo of a ship, as you can probably tell. It's called the Komagata Maru, and what happened was that in 1914, this ship of refugees arrives from India. Now, they're not just Muslims, and in fact, most of them are Sikhs, and there are some Hindus and some Muslims as well on this ship. And these are political refugees from British India. So the British are ruling all of India. India is united at this time. There's a lot of political persecution, right? And these people are trying to find a way out, trying to find some refuge, and they end up somewhere in the west coast of Canada. Like, you guys must have heard of Vancouver, right? So there they are, and the Canadian government basically refuses to let them come in, right? And they said, no way, we can't let these people in, except if you're a doctor, if you're medically trained, right? So this is an interesting thing where they actually figured out who was actually medically trained, because Canada had some kind of shortage at the time. They let all those guys in. Anyone else, you're no good for us. You can go back, you can do whatever. So these people, there's a constant sort of battle. They're not sort of forced out of the Vancouver harbor. They're not allowed into the city either. There are Muslims in the city. There are a few Muslims. There are a few Sikhs and Hindus as well already living in Vancouver in British Columbia. And they sort of organized what became known as the shore committees, right? This fight happening on the shores of Canada. And they fought a legal battle. They all organized extremely well. It was actually, the whole committee was led by a Muslim who had come here. He has a fascinating story that I can't really go into for lack of time, but this guy was just like, he came to Canada around 1900, and he was running all over the place, running from police, fighting legal battles and all kinds of things, and they just couldn't deal with him. His name is Hussein Rahim. He's an Indian Muslim, and he's leading these shore committees in the legal fight to let these refugees in. And it's just like the intercommunal sort of harmony at the time. All the meetings are held in Sikh temples. In fact, I think there was only one Sikh temple where they held all the meetings, because there were no mosques in British Columbia at the time. And they constantly fight this battle, but unfortunately at the end, the government simply, after a few months, the Canadian government refuses to let them in, and they have to leave, and it's the Pacific Ocean. Where are you going to go? They go all the way back, and they keep getting rejected in a string of countries until the British catch up with them and force them to go back to India. And then as soon as they touch Indian soil, unfortunately, most of them were shot on the spot and they were killed. And the rest were put in house arrest for the rest of their lives. So Canada, the Canadian government has repeatedly apologized for this now, but it's kind of late. Another story for which the Torontonians may be more familiar with. Oh, okay, sorry, thank you. I'm a bit sick. I apologize for that. And I'm going to try to move through quickly here. One thing I'll mention right now is I'm not going to go all the way to the present with the history of Muslims in Canada. I'm going to go just up to about the 1970s. What happened in the 70s is that immigration opens up, and then there's this huge boom, and then there's just so many stories to tell that it's just completely out of control. So maybe we can have that conversation at a different time, inshallah. And you can find, I think, more information generally about that as well, just online if you do a search. This is the story of the first Muslim in Toronto, right? His name is Rajib Asim. He was an Albanian, again, a political refugee from Albania, came to Toronto in 1914. And as far as I've been able to trace, at least in Toronto, he was the only Muslim for at least the next 10 to 12 years before the next Muslims who actually arrived were some of his family also from Albania. And then in the late 1920s and 1930s, other Muslims started to trickle into Toronto. But again, faced a lot of discrimination. So he came, I think I said 1914. He came in 1912. In 1914, the war breaks out, and for a lot of people, there really is no difference between Albanian and Turkish. Like, you're all like Ottomans. And as we'll see in a moment, being somebody who was an Ottoman in Canada was a huge problem at the time, right before World War I and during World War I. So nobody would give him a job. He faced a lot of discrimination. He eventually set up his own sweets business in downtown Toronto in the late 1910s. It was called High Park Sweets. No longer exists, but he would sell like Turkish delights and whatever he was capable of making. But in the 1960s, he was extremely active, right? And in the 1960s, once the community started to form, he really assumed a leadership role in the community for establishing some of the first permanent musallas and the first masjid in Toronto. And for me, it's such an inspiring story because the first thing personally, we tend to fall back on when we face a difficult situation is the community. To have masjids around you, to have Muslim friends, to have MSAs in universities and colleges, and even something like that we take for granted, like having a halal burger place down the street or something. And you just think about this person living as the only Muslim, as far as anybody knows, in Toronto for years and years, all on your own, but they still maintain their faith to the extent that even like 40 years later, when there is a community around you, you still have that faith and people look up to you. You're the inspiration for them to take a leadership role to sort of establish this community in Toronto. And here we have it. I know you guys are having a huge discussion right now about concentration camps and things in this country. Surprise, surprise, in Canada, Muslims have spent time in concentration camps during the First World War. This is, I think, one of the most secretive stories in Canadian history that we really, really don't like to talk about. So let me run it down. So there's a town called Brantford, Ontario. It's close to Hamilton, and this is all sort of in the vicinity of Toronto, not too far away from there. And Brantford was once the third largest industrial city in Canada after Toronto and Montreal. So that's where all the factories were. There's a nice, the Brant River and everything going through it. So it's a good place to set up some industry. And again, a lot of these people from what we now call Turkey or Ottomans, they're running away. They're trying to escape this situation of conscription and forced military service. So a small community starts to develop of Muslims in this small town called Brantford. And it's really interesting because, again, this isn't a big city. This is a pretty small town, even now, but especially if we're talking about 100 years ago. And but eventually, even the Brantford community grows to a few dozen Muslims. And there's this really interesting, if you go into the newspaper archives of this small town and you look, there's an interesting article about one of the workers passing away. These are all sort of young men. One of the workers passes away. So they're having the janazah, they're having the funeral for this man, and they're taking him through the street to the cemetery. So this becomes the oldest Muslim sort of dedicated burial ground in Canada as well. This happens also around 1914, 1913. And the whole town is sort of watching around on the main street. They're just like, they've never seen this kind of funeral, right? So it's just such a curiosity for them, and they're sort of like lining the streets, and the reporter, whoever it was, is writing a story about what an incredible scene it was that this funeral was happening. The Mohammedans were having their funeral, right? But anyways, the war breaks out. As you can tell, if you're a German, if you're an Austrian, if you're a Hungarian, if you're a Turk, you're screwed, right? Because now Canada is fighting for the British Empire against all of these, the countries of your origin, and you are what they call the enemy alien. You can't really be trusted. Now, there was a bit of like a betrayal here because the government, or at least the local authorities in Brantford, said to these Brantford Turks, as they're called, it's not like a problem, like, you guys aren't like that, whatever, but you do have to show up at the local jail, and you have to sort of register yourself. I'm going to stamp you and take your information or whatever. So people start showing up, and they tell them a particular time of day to show up. This is after the war breaks out, and they start sort of just pulling people aside based on small things like that. There's no details about what it was, but it was just like, if you can imagine, like one answer that was not a good answer or a wrong answer or something like that, or we have to investigate further, whatever, keep pulling people aside until they have a good, this is just a few dozen young men to begin with, and you have like a few dozen people now who are just standing aside, and that same sort of night they're put onto train cars, they're still under arrest, and they're shipped like several, I think 100 kilometers away to Kingston, Ontario, which is close to Ottawa, to the capital, which was a military base. And then from there, they're sent to this far, like Toronto, like Americans are like, what's Toronto? Like in the middle of nowhere, right? Like some kind of village. But if you go like 200-300 kilometers north of Toronto, you are literally in the middle of nowhere, right? And there's this small town, like even now, it's like a deserted, like small town. It's called Kapuskasing, Ontario. The government, just before the war started, had discovered that this whole area is incredibly rich in minerals, right? It's called the clay belt. Even now in Ontario, it's called the clay belt. It's some of the most fertile farmland in the region. So what they did was they got a perfect opportunity. So they take these Germans, Austrians, Hungarians, Turks, and by the way, eventually they end up rounding up all the Turks, like every single one in Bradford, and shipping them all up there. And these people are now living in this concentration camp in like the middle of nowhere for 3 to 4 years in Kapuskasing, Ontario, and they're just put to hard labor of clearing the land. If you want to farm something but it's forested area, you have to clear the land. So for like 4 years, you have all of these people just chopping up the wood and clearing all that land. And what really, so one interesting thing that happens is that after the war, almost no Brantford Turks, the original Turks, come back to Brantford, right? So it's really unclear what actually happened to many of these people, also to the Germans, Austrians, the other people who were sent there. It's unclear what happened to any of these people. And in the early 1940s, when everybody is caught up in the middle of World War II, the government of Canada, issues sort of an order to quietly have all records related to this particular camp destroyed. So they actually destroyed all the records about what happened at this camp, who was there, whatever. So it's unfortunate, we don't know the story, but this is Canada that we're talking about, right? So just to give you a sense that in any place, no place is perfect, and in Canada we sometimes fall into this mistake of assuming that we're better than this country and we're better than that country and we're nice and we're this and that, but the situation can radically change in any place. Not that we should distrust people, not that we should distrust our neighbors or our governments or anything like that, but that we also need to be vigilant and prepared and know our rights and know what to do in many different situations, so that if a situation comes up, we're prepared to deal with it. And one of the sad things about this whole enemy aliens thing is that Muslims, and remember how small that number was, it was like less than 500 in 1921, but 22 Muslims actually served for Canada in the First World War. So even out of an extremely small community, 22 of them actually went over to Europe to serve. In the photo here, you see Hassan Amat, who was from London, Ontario, and he's the only Muslim known to have died, only Canadian Muslim known to have died fighting in World War I, and he fought at these battles that are considered like sort of foundational in Canadian history, like the Battle of Vimy Ridge. Canada was born on the slopes of Vimy Ridge. When all other countries fell, Canada succeeded, Canada, this and that, and the Battle of Hill 70, etc. So he actually passed away, and there has been some recognition in recent years, I think, about his contribution to the war effort. But there were 21 others as well who did manage to survive the war and come back. Just quickly, this is a picture from a book that Imam Tawakkul actually has with him. And this is the early community in London, Ontario. As you can tell, mostly of Arab background, and I believe this is early 1920s. You can look through the whole book, I think, if you have the opportunity later on, and Imam Tawakkul will tell you many of these stories, inshallah, later on. Now, the people who were going west, remember we said they were all going west, many of them became involved in the fur trade, and the fur trade was huge in Canada because of the huge market for it in Europe, all these clothes and latest fashions and things that were made out of fur. So Canada, a huge part of its history has been this fur trade. So many of them became very successful fur traders. Why? Because Canada is also known as the land of monopolies, right? Because it's just such a big sort of area, whatever kind of work you're trying to do, whatever you're trying to cover, is such a huge sort of space that you have to cover, that people or organizations, companies, I should say, always make these sweet deals to the government. It's like, we have the money to actually put all of this system in place and build this industry, but we want a monopoly, we want exclusive rights, etc. So there was this company called the Hudson's Bay Company. I don't know if you guys have the Bay or Zellers or anything like that here, but this huge company in Canada, which still exists today, and they have like shopping outlets and stuff. And they had this monopoly over like they own land that's like bigger than most countries in the world today. I think it's huge. Now what happens is that when these first Muslims start to come, for the indigenous people, it's a break from the monopoly. Why? So the Hudson's Bay Company, indigenous people have been trapping these furs for thousands of years. They know how to do it. The native people, they know, they're experts in this. Hudson's Bay Company just can't do it on their own, but Hudson's Bay Company is basically buying it from them at gunpoint. It says, I set the price. If you don't like my price, I'm gonna kill you and take it anyways. So here's the money I'm gonna give you, and that's it. That's the end of the deal. So this is a kind of sort of horrible situation for the indigenous people that's going on for a long time. And early Jewish settlers in that part of Canada and early Muslim settlers in that part of Canada are really like disrupting this trade. And some of them become extremely successful. I don't have time to go into the stories in great detail. Maybe we can talk about them later on. But some of them become extremely successful. It's a huge commitment. It's a huge sacrifice. These are not easy places to live. It's cold. It's difficult, right? This is like northern Canada. Like, I wish I had a map. I think I do at some point about just how far north this is. Some of these people are sailing into the Arctic Circle to actually get their furs from there and then bring them down to trade them, etc. Many of them start their stores. They become successful enough. So these are some early Muslims from the 1930s. One thing you notice, like, the name Ali becomes like Ali and things like that. Like, there are certain things that you have to do just to not get into trouble or not ruffle anyone's feathers or not raise any suspicion. You have to change your name a bit. You have to change your look a bit. And they do have the advantage, obviously, that they can often pass off as white, right? So there you have it, like a picture of I'm not sure who these people are exactly, but they are Arabs, Lebanese Arabs, that's what the caption said, and they're trading in furs far in the north of Canada. The person on your right side here, his name is Ali Abu Chadi. He has an incredible story about coming to Canada as a young man with his uncle. His uncle kind of just picks him up, says, "Uncle, where are you going?" He says, "I'm going to Beirut." He's like, "I want to see the big city as well." He's from sort of a village in Lebanon. So he's like, "Just take me to the city." And then along the way, they somehow make the decision to bring him to Canada. And, it's just an incredible story. And I'm just going to jump all the way to when this person, sort of his uncle decides to leave. And now he's a teenager. He's alone in Canada, sort of no community around him. But he decides to stay. He says, "I'm not going back to Lebanon. I'm going to stay here." And over the decades, he builds this. He faces many challenges. His store burns down like twice. He faces challenges from the Hudson's Bay Company because obviously they're extremely upset that these people, he's also in the fur trade, that they're getting involved in the fur trade and disrupting the Hudson Bay Company's business. And he lives right into the 1970s. He has very old age. Mashallah, he's considered one of the sort of founding people of the Muslim community in Western Canada, in Alberta, in Edmonton. And he makes huge contributions to the first masjid, to getting so many other people who came to Canada in those early days settled. I have written about his story online. There's others who have written about his story, so I can give you his name after if you ask me. His name is Ali Abu Jadi. I would definitely encourage you to read it, because just as Muslims, I think it's extremely inspiring how motivated, how entrepreneurial, how dedicated this person was to sort of saying that, no, I'm not going to leave, I'm not going to go anywhere else. This is my home. I will contribute to the wider society, and I will achieve success for myself and my community as well. Now, one of the earliest written sources that we have about the Muslim community in Canada is by Peter Baker, right, whose actual name is like Ahmad Ali Farhan, but again, to kind of, get by in some parts of Canada at the time, there's a lot of racism, as you're about to see in a moment. He has to change his name. He wrote about, again, you see, an Arctic Arab, that's what the book is called. He writes about his experience. He's working far in the north of Canada, so actually within the Arctic Circle, and that's a picture of him there. He, again, has this incredible story where he comes and he faces all of these challenges, establishes himself as a fur trader in places that are so cold that I can't imagine, right? And you see in the picture there, I've highlighted him. That's a picture because he's the first elected Muslim politician in Canadian history. He was elected in 1964. He became I don't know what the equivalent here would be, but sort of the provincial government. He was one of the members, one of the local representatives in that. But along the way, he faced this incredible challenge from the Hudson's Bay Company, who are again trying to shut down his business. And they eventually, come to straight-on bullying tactics. So what he does is he goes to Ottawa. He travels all the way there, which isn't easy. Getting anywhere in Canada is not easy. So he travels all the way to Ottawa, complains to the federal government about this bullying that's happening and why there's a monopoly, to raise all of these questions. And just to give you a sense again that Canada today isn't the way Canada has always been, this is the response he gets from the Interior Minister of Canada in 1926. So when he files his complaint, you can see there's what we call Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and this racism towards Indigenous people, all in like a 2-second statement, right? So I often try to bring this up because I think just Canadians, we need to be more self-critical, right? And obviously the rest of the world needs to know as well that we face our challenges. There are many challenges we've overcome, but there are many challenges that we still have to work on and still have to overcome, right? So this is a direct quote, and this is what he was told, but perseverance, keep going. And he himself, can you imagine somebody being told something like this and then going on to become the first elected politician in that same country within just a few decades? It's incredible stories of perseverance by these people. Just a few more slides I want to go through. This is the first sort of Muslim cemetery, but after the Brantford one. The Brantford one, I guess, was sort of a burial ground within a general cemetery. This is the first dedicated Muslim cemetery, and this is out in the east in the Halifax area. Not exactly in Halifax, but in Truro, which is quite close to Halifax. One thing to note, I think is interesting, is that before we have a masjid, we have a cemetery, right? Because obviously, and this is the thing about how Muslims use their resources. This is a lesson I draw from it, right? It's like you can't just bury somebody anywhere, but you can generally pray anywhere, right? So, obviously it's important to have masajid as well, but it is a question of priorities and what people did first. So before somebody thought of building a masjid, and the story of how the first masjid was built is actually quite interesting, but somebody thought of purchasing land for Muslims to have their own cemetery, and this is something you can still visit. It's still there. This is like a sign that's sort of been refurbished, I guess, but it's still there. And one interesting thing is that Halifax was one of the major world harbors, so all of this fur and all of these things are coming into Canada, going out of Canada, are going through Halifax. So a lot of sailors from all over the world would come to Halifax. They never lived in Canada, but anyone who was sick and happened to die within Canada, was also brought here and buried. So there are many people buried here. There's some very old graves that never actually lived in Canada, but they were just destined to be buried here. So that's something interesting as well. In Saskatchewan, like I guess the Canadian North Dakota or something, in the prairie provinces, we have, again, these early farming families. Some of them are very well established and very old communities. I won't go into the details. Habib Saloom is actually a Arab Christian, and he's a sort of a food writer and a historian, and he has many different roles. He's written this cookbook based on, he's very sort of elderly now, and he's written this cookbook about the 1930s and 40s, especially from his youngest years, what he remembers of the Great Depression, and how difficult it was to sort of survive in those difficult sort of circumstances when the economies collapsed everywhere. And he's written it as a cookbook, but it's also lined with stories from his childhood about how close everybody was regardless of their differences, just because of how difficult it was to survive. So it is an extremely positive story, which involves some Muslim settlers as well from very early in Canadian history. Mohammedan Church. So the Great Depression, again, so by the 1930s, the Depression hits in 1929, right, and lasts for several years. By the 1930s, there is a sort of strong Muslim community out west. There's a strong one in London, Ontario, and again, there are these pockets of Toronto and Montreal, Vancouver, they're like small pockets of Muslims here and there, but it's really London, Ontario, and then it's Alberta where the Muslims have really concentrated themselves. And as the story goes, but Alberta is obviously this huge place, and even the cities within Alberta are very far apart, and you have all of these fur traders, and they're naturally mobile, they're moving around all over the place. So when the Depression hits, everyone's business goes down. So what they decide to do is have regular meetings in Edmonton, which is the biggest city by this point. It's like, let's all come together, because what does the Muslim community, or really any community, do when the times actually get tough is they tend to come together. It's like, let's come together, bring our families together, spend some time, just a little bit of uplifting. We can discuss, we can see who's in a particularly bad situation, see what we can do to help that person out, etc. So these conversations start happening. Out of these conversations comes up this other conversation about, we don't have a mosque in this country. You know, it's probably the first time that this many Muslims from a particular region have come and sat together and talked about anything, because again, they're living extremely difficult lives and they're all over the place. So they're talking about this. They're like, we don't have a mosque, right? So this is where the conversation starts in the 1930s about building a mosque in Canada, Mohammedan Church. So eventually it becomes a full-on project that's, there's discussed in the newspaper, etc. The project gets underway. The project is led by a really interesting person named Hilwi Hamdan. So her story as well is one of those extremely interesting ones. I think I'm already going over time, so I'm going to quickly wrap this up. That I think her story should be read by everyone if you get the opportunity, and I can tell you where you can do that later on, inshallah. But she comes as a young bride from Lebanon. Her husband was one of the people who had gone out west, established himself as a fur trader, then gone back to Lebanon to find a bride. He brings her back. He actually come to New York and traveled through the United States, through like Chicago, I believe, and then all the way up to Alberta. And she has this incredible passion for community service, for not sort of idling around, but actually doing things for others, even when there's no Muslims around. And she's living in a mostly indigenous settlement. They have this young family, has this extremely close relationship with all the indigenous people around them. But anyways, when the conversation, they later moved to Edmonton, and when the conversation comes up about who's actually going to lead this project of building the masjid, her name is brought up, right? And she herself brings up the objections that sometimes other people bring up. She says, first of all, I'm a woman, so who's going to take me seriously, right? It's in the 1930s. And second of all, I don't speak very good English. And obviously to get land and to get contractors and to build masjid, everything, you're going to need to do all of these things. So what I love about this story is that the community actually comes around her, and at that moment when she is doubting herself, people show that we believe in you, you can do it. We don't care if you can't speak English, we don't care if you're a woman and you're disadvantaged in society, it doesn't matter, you're going to lead this project. And the kind of motivation that gives her, the way this masjid was built was going street to street, knocking on the doors of like Jews and Christians and Muslims, saying we want to build a masjid, we want to build a house of worship for our community, can you give some donations, having meetings with the mayor of Edmonton, all of these things. She does all of those things despite previously doubting herself. So it's an extremely important lesson about sometimes people have just a little bit of doubt, but we need to see the potential in that person, really push them forward, and then see the incredible things that they're able to achieve. So the project goes extremely successfully. Lots of work done by horses before engines really took off, right? And it's designed, as you'll see in a moment, the whole thing is designed as a sort of a modified church kind of building, right? With some minarets and just extremely practical. If you see the pictures of the inside, you can actually visit this building, this structure. It's now not in the same location, and it's not used as a masjid, but it has been preserved as a national heritage site in Canada. If you ever get a chance, I do encourage you to go and visit it. Even though the masjid organization is called the Al Rashid Mosque, is already there. Now this is where we get into the debates about first masjid, second masjid, third masjid. Imam Tawakkul and I were having a discussion earlier today. In the US, I know you guys had that one mosque in like Ross or something, right? Which was active for a few years, and then it got shut down, and then you have like the nation's temples, and you have all these things, and then we have this mosque going up in Canada, and another one also in Alberta a few years later, which I think is the next picture, Lac La Biche, Alberta, which is even more in the middle of nowhere. So at some point we should all sit together and figure out like the order of things and what exactly happened, because it would be good to know. This one's in Lac La Biche, Alberta, which is again just another one of these fur trading towns where a lot of early Muslims like Ali Abu Chadi, and Ali Abu Chadi, especially in this town, is just considered like the father figure of the community, because he was the first one to go there and help so many others settle there. Just a few more things to run through. In Quebec, we haven't talked much about Quebec. You might hear a lot in the news about Quebec and Muslims because there's this constant struggle to have sort of religious freedoms appreciated in Quebec. They're extremely like French-oriented, French culture, lots of secularism instincts, and I don't know how to describe it, but this again, so we've been fighting battles in Quebec for a long time. This is in the 1960s. When the group of Muslims that have settled in Montreal actually fought a legal battle to have Muslims get the same religious sort of privileges officially get those privileges that Christians and Jews had. So they actually had to fight a legal battle before they could be recognized as a religious group and then get these privileges, which, as you might have heard in the news, we're still struggling to preserve. 1950s, community starts to grow. This is Eid prayer in Ottawa. First Muslim family came to Ottawa, which is the capital of Canada, in the 1910s or so. And they were also of Arab background. But by obviously diplomats are often the first Muslims in any place, right? Because they have to go and they have to deal. So in Ottawa, you often have these diplomats, and this is the Eid prayer. And one interesting thing is, it said in the description that many of the people in this picture actually drove up from New York, and they came from Quebec and all these faraway places, just because in like 1951, when this picture was taken, there were so few places where Eid prayer was actually organized. There were so few Eid prayers, right? So another sort of blessing to appreciate. Quickly running through a few pictures. Muslims praying in the snow in downtown because they don't have a proper place to pray. Downtown Toronto, I should say. So it's just, Professor Kadir Beg, who's actually leading the prayer there, was a professor at the University of Toronto who did a lot of work to establish the Muslim community in Toronto. some newspaper coverage starts to happen in the 1950s, 1960s as well. Obviously the first clip you can see there is from much before, where they're trying to describe like Ramadan, and you can see Ramadan highlighted. That's the sort of search term I was using when I was digging into the archives, and it's highlighted there. But all kind of like crazy things, like how they describe Muslims. It's really funny to read now, and even I've talked to my friends in journalism, and I'm like, can you believe this? And they're like, this is nuts, right? But some coverage, and a person who I would say first media spokesperson for the Muslims in Canada is Malcolm X, right? Malcolm X visited Toronto just a few months actually before he was martyred, and a huge boost for the Muslim community there, because again, there aren't too many Muslims even at this time. So when this person comes, and you've heard so much about him and his personality, and it just grabs your attention immediately, like even now through film, or when you hear his voice, or when you read his autobiography, any of those things. So when he came, the community was extremely sort of gravitated towards him. And I've had so many people come up to me and say like, that's my uncle, or that's like my dad, like in the picture over there with him. And they're extremely proud, like, oh my God, my dad met Malcolm X, right? So it's like, subhanAllah, what an impact this person had. And the reason I say he's a media spokesperson, when he came, he did a very interesting interview about his beliefs and about the way he practiced with CBC, our national broadcaster. So I'm gonna wrap it up there, even though I was just getting started. But I'm gonna wrap it up there, and hopefully we can discuss more when there's a chance for Q&A. And I hope you guys learned some interesting food for thought, inshallah. Jazakallah khair.